The maintenance worker climbs past the locked door to the roof, past the humming vents, to the row of dull metal water tanks that feed every faucet below. He lifts a hatch, and the smell hits first, then the shape in the water. In a building that once sold Los Angeles glamour by the night, the truth is now floating in its own drinking supply, and a missing traveler finally has an address. But this is not a single mystery on a single roof, because the Cecil was already famous for bodies long before Elisa Lam. The question is how a grand hotel became a machine for loss, a palace built to outrun poverty. In the roaring 20s, Main Street promised safety in marble and brass, right up until the city's money moved on. The Cecil Hotel opened its doors on December 19, 1924. And the timing could not have been more perfect or more cursed. Downtown Los Angeles was booming. Oil money flowed through the streets. The stock market climbed. And on the corner of Main and 7th, 3 hoteliers named William Banks Hanner, Robert H. Shops, and Charles L. Dix erected 14 stories of ambition wrapped in brick and terracotta. They called it the Cecil, after the daughter of one of the investors, and they intended it to be a monument to respectable middle-class travel. The lobby gleamed, polished marble stretched beneath chandeliers that caught the California sun filtering through tall windows. The design was Beaux Arts stripped of excess, dignified rather than flashy, targeting business travelers and families who wanted to feel wealthy without spending a fortune. 700 rooms filled the building. 301 of those were suites with private baths, a luxury that mattered in an era when shared facilities were still common. The architects had designed a vertical city, a self-contained world where guests could sleep, dine, and socialize without ever stepping back onto the sidewalk. Main Street itself was respectable then. Department stores lined the blocks. Theaters drew crowds each evening. The financial district hummed nearby. The Cecil's location seemed strategic, positioned to catch the wave of downtown expansion that everyone assumed would last forever. Room rates started at $1.50 per night, affordable enough to fill beds consistently, but expensive enough to signal standards. The building's scale demanded occupancy. 14 floors need heat, light, and staff. 700 rooms require laundry, maintenance, and constant turnover. The math was simple. The hotel survived only if it stayed full. But the Cecil carried a flaw in its foundation that no architect could have predicted. It was too large to adapt and too expensive to abandon. When the neighborhood changed, the building could not simply move. When tastes shifted, it could not reinvent itself without enormous capital. The hotel was built for a Los Angeles that was already starting to vanish the moment the doors opened. Within 5 years, everything would collapse. The dream was occupancy. Every night, every room, every key turned, and every bed made. That hunger would define the building's entire life. The Cecil needed bodies the way a factory needs raw material. And when the supply of respectable travelers dried up, the hotel would find other sources. But in December of 1924, none of that was visible yet. The lobby lights burned bright, the elevators climbed smoothly, and downtown Los Angeles still believed its own advertising. What happens when a building is too large to be allowed to fail? When the lobby lights turned cold. The Great Depression did not break the Cecil with fire. It broke it with empty beds and quiet hallways. October of 1929 arrived like a trapdoor opening beneath the entire country. The stock market collapsed. Banks failed. Fortunes evaporated overnight. And in downtown Los Angeles, the hotels that had thrived on business travel and tourist dollars suddenly found themselves competing for a shrinking pool of guests who could still afford a room. The Cecil, just 5 years old, faced its first existential test. Empty rooms are expensive. Heat still runs. Lights still burn. Staff still expect paychecks. But revenue stops when the key stays on the hook. Management began cutting costs wherever possible. Housekeeping shifts shrank. Maintenance deferred repairs. The lobby still looked presentable, but behind the scenes, the building began to age faster than it should have. Paint jobs were delayed. Carpets wore thin. Small mechanical failures went unfixed because the budget no longer stretched to cover them. The hotel also began accepting a different class of tenant. Rates dropped. Standards loosened. Long-term residents moved in. People who needed cheap shelter more than they needed luxury. The Cecil started to split into two realities. The transient rooms on the lower floors still tried to cater to short-stay guests, while the upper floors quietly converted into something closer to a boarding house. The building's identity began to fracture, and then the deaths began. The first recorded suicide at the Cecil occurred in 1931, just 7 years after opening. A guest checked in, climbed to an upper floor, and jumped. The newspapers covered it briefly. The hotel management expressed regret. Then business continued. Another suicide followed in 1932, then another in 1934. The pattern was not yet visible, but the foundation was being laid. Buildings develop reputations the way people do, slowly, and then all at once. Each tragedy added weight to the Cecil story, and weight attracts more weight. Some would later claim the hotel was cursed, that something in the architecture or the land beneath it drew despair. But the simpler explanation is density and neglect. Pack enough struggling people into tight quarters with thin walls and minimal oversight, and statistical probability does the rest. The Cecil was not haunted. It was overcrowded, under-maintained, and located in a neighborhood that was beginning its long, slow collapse. Those three factors alone explain most of what followed. By the late 1930s, downtown Los Angeles was no longer the gleaming center of the city. Wealth had started moving west, toward Wilshire Boulevard and the beach. The financial district remained, but the hotels that once served it faced new competition from newer buildings in better locations. The Cecil was already old, already tired, already marked by tragedy, and the worst was still decades away. The hotel that once promised marble and chandeliers now offered something darker: anonymity, low rent, and a place where nobody asked too many questions. That transformation did not happen overnight. It accumulated, one lowered standard at a time, until the building's survival strategy became its trap. The lobby lights still burned, but they no longer promised safety. They promised only a bed, and even that came with no guarantees. The neighborhood that ate its hotel. Step outside the revolving door and the city changes, block by block, until the Cecil is no longer a destination, but a last stop. Downtown Los Angeles has always been a battleground between capital and collapse. After World War II, the fight intensified. White flight drained the urban core. Freeway construction carved through neighborhoods. Department stores closed or relocated. The theaters that once lit up Main Street either converted to showing exploitation films or shuttered entirely. And in the vacuum left by commerce, poverty concentrated. Skid Row did not appear by accident. It emerged from policy decisions that funneled the city's homeless population into a 50-block area just east of downtown's financial center. By the 1970s, the Cecil Hotel sat on the edge of this zone, close enough to respectability to still claim a downtown address, but too close to desperation to attract anyone with options. The building became a border outpost, a last piece of infrastructure before the streets turned rough. The hotel's location became its curse and its lifeline. Rents stayed low because the neighborhood scared away wealthier tenants. But low rents meant the rooms stayed full, occupied by people who had nowhere else to go. Disabled veterans, mentally ill individuals released from institutions with no follow-up care, sex workers, addicts, people fleeing domestic violence, people one paycheck from the street. The Cecil absorbed them all because its business model depended on volume, not selectivity. By the 1980s, the building operated as a de facto social service without the structure or funding of one. Residents lived in rooms meant for overnight stays, sometimes for months or years. The hallways smelled of cigarette smoke and mildew. The elevators broke down frequently. Security was minimal. Management collected rent and did little else. The building had become a pressure valve for the city, a place where Los Angeles could store the people it did not want to see, hidden behind a facade that still looked like a hotel from the outside. This was not entirely the Cecil's fault, but it was absolutely the Cecil's function. The city needed somewhere to put its overflow of struggling humanity, and buildings like the Cecil provided the answer. 14 floors can house hundreds of people. 700 rooms can cycle through thousands in a year. The scale that once promised luxury now enabled a different kind of efficiency, warehousing human need without addressing its causes. The dream still lived in a twisted way. The hotel still filled its beds. Keys still changed hands. Revenue still flowed, even if the rates had dropped to $5 or $10 per night. But the cost was paid in dignity, safety, and the slow erosion of the building's soul. Every lowered standard made the next one easier. Every tragedy that went unaddressed made the next one more likely. And the city kept looking away. As long as the problem stayed contained within the Cecil's walls, as long as they did not spill too obviously into the financial district a few blocks west, nobody intervened. The building stood. It served a purpose. That was enough. But purposes can change, and sometimes they turn predatory. The Cecil had become a machine designed to extract the last bits of cash from people who had nothing left to give. And machines like that, when fed long enough, start to smell like death. A business model made of desperation. The Cecil stayed open by selling silence, thin walls, and a key that came with no promises. Hotels are supposed to protect their guests. That is the implicit contract. You pay, you receive safety and service. But the Cecil had long ago stopped pretending that contracts still applied. By the 1990s, the hotel operated on a different principle: maximum occupancy at minimum oversight. The math was brutal and effective: 700 rooms across 14 floors. At any given time, between 400 and 600 of those rooms were occupied. Some guests stayed for a night, some stayed for a year. Turnover was constant, which meant the front desk processed dozens of check-ins and check-outs weekly. With that volume came anonymity. Nobody tracked who was coming or going with much rigor. Pay your rate, get your key, and what happened behind the door was your business until it became a problem loud enough to warrant intervention. The Cecil's floor plan made oversight nearly impossible, even if management had wanted it. Long corridors stretched the length of each floor, lined with doors on both sides. The hallways were dim, the lighting insufficient. Stairwells provided alternate routes between floors, bypassing the elevators entirely. A person could move through the building unseen if they knew the layout. That architectural feature, designed in 1924 for elegance and flow, became a liability decades later when the building housed transients, criminals, and people in crisis. Security was minimal. 1 or 2 staff members at the front desk, sometimes a guard in the lobby. But 14 floors are impossible to monitor with so few eyes. The upper floors, especially, became nearly lawless. Residents knew which rooms to avoid. They learned which hallways felt dangerous after dark. The building developed its own internal geography of risk. Room rates by the 1990s ranged from $14 to $28 per night, depending on whether you wanted a window or a private bathroom. That pricing structure kept beds filled, but attracted clientele with limited resources and often significant personal crises. Mental illness, addiction, criminal history, domestic violence survivors with no support network. These were not bad people, but they were people in bad situations, and the Cecil offered shelter without support services, which meant crises festered until they exploded. Management decisions made things worse. Maintenance budgets stayed lean. Repairs were reactive, not preventive. The building's infrastructure aged poorly. Plumbing leaked. Electrical systems sparked. Fire alarms sometimes failed to work. The Cecil was profitable enough to stay open, but not profitable enough, or not interested enough, to invest in making it safe. That gap between revenue and responsibility defined the hotel's late 20th century existence. The building also became a known location for criminal activity. Prostitution rings operated in some rooms. Drug deals happened in the stairwells. Stolen goods moved through the hallways. The Cecil was not a criminal enterprise itself, but it was a space where crime could thrive because nobody was watching carefully enough to stop it. That reputation spread, which attracted more criminal activity, which deepened the reputation, in which made legitimate guests even less likely to stay there. 301 suites with private bathrooms. That detail from 1924 still technically applied, but the bathrooms were cracked and stained by the 90s. The fixtures rusted, the tiles broken. The suites were just larger cages in the same failing system. And yet, the Cecil survived. Year after year, decade after decade, it filled beds and collected rent. The business model worked in the narrowest sense. The building stayed open. But survival is not the same as health, and the Cecil's survival came at a cost measured in human suffering. Every night, hundreds of people slept inside a structure that could not protect them, and the hotel's only promise was a roof and a lock that might or might not hold. The question was never whether something terrible would happen. The question was how many terrible things could happen before someone outside the building's walls finally noticed. The killers who checked in quietly. Serial predators do not need haunted halls. They need anonymity, and the Cecil specialized in both. The summer of 1984 was hot and tense in Los Angeles. A string of brutal home invasions and murders had the city on edge. The killer, who the press would name the Night Stalker, moved through neighborhoods seemingly at random, breaking into houses after dark, assaulting and killing residents with shocking violence. Police had few leads. The attacks continued through 1985. And during part of that spree, Richard Ramirez paid $14 per night to stay at the Cecil Hotel. Ramirez did not commit his crimes at the hotel. He used it as a base, a place to sleep between attacks, a location where he could come and go without drawing attention. The Cecil's anonymity protected him the way it protected anyone who needed to disappear into a crowd. Nobody at the front desk asked where he was going when he left at night. Nobody questioned the blood on his clothes when he returned. He was just another transient face in a building full of them. The lobby where Ramirez sat, where he smoked and waited, was the same lobby that had gleamed with chandeliers in 1924. But by 1985, the chandeliers were gone or dark. The marble was scuffed. The space felt hollow, populated by people who did not want to be seen. Ramirez fit perfectly. He stayed on the top floor, the 14th, and in a room that gave him a view of the city he was terrorizing. He was arrested in August of 1985, captured after a dramatic chase in East Los Angeles. Only later did investigators confirm he had stayed at the Cecil during his killing spree. The hotel's connection to the Night Stalker case became part of its mythology, a macabre detail that true crime enthusiasts would repeat for decades. But the detail mattered less for what it revealed about Ramirez, and more for what it revealed about the hotel. The Cecil had become the kind of place where a serial killer could blend in. This was not the only time. Years earlier, in 1964, a woman named Goldie Osgood was raped and murdered in her room at the Cecil. She had been a long-term resident, a retired telephone operator who lived alone. Her killer, Jacques Eilinger, was another resident, a man she knew from the building. He was convicted and sent to prison. The murder barely made news outside the immediate area. Just another violent death in a building that collected them. Then there was Jack Unterweger, an Austrian journalist who stayed at the Cecil in 1991 while writing about crime in Los Angeles. Unterweger was himself a convicted murderer who had been released from prison and reinvented as a writer and minor celebrity in Europe. While staying at the Cecil, he killed at least 3 sex workers in Los Angeles, strangling them and dumping their bodies around the city. He was not caught until years later, back in Austria, where he was tried and convicted. He died by suicide in his cell the night of his conviction. The pattern is clear. The Cecil did not create killers, but it offered them exactly what they needed: cheap rooms, minimal scrutiny, and proximity to vulnerable populations. The hotel sat on the edge of Skid Row, where sex workers and transients moved through the streets nightly. A predator could hunt there and return to the Cecil without ever seeming out of place. The building became complicit through its indifference. 700 rooms, 14 floors, hundreds of people cycling through each month. That scale made patterns invisible. A disappearance here, a suspicious guest there, all of it lost in the noise of constant turnover. Management could not track everyone even if they tried, and the evidence suggests they did not try very hard. The hotel's business model depended on not asking questions, which meant it could not identify threats until after they had already acted. The paranormal narrative that surrounds the Cecil often focuses on ghosts, on the idea that so much death has soaked into the walls that the building itself is cursed. But the real horror is simpler and more damning. The Cecil was not haunted by spirits. It was haunted by neglect, by a business model that prioritized filling beds over protecting the people in them, by a city that allowed a concentration of poverty and desperation to fester without intervention. Ramirez did not need a cursed hotel. He needed a place where nobody was watching. The Cecil gave him that. The building's true crime legacy is not proof of supernatural evil. It is proof of systemic failure dressed up as a hotel. A rebrand that could not wash blood. Changing the sign is easy, but changing the building's function is a war against its own history. Sometime in the early 2000s, new ownership took control of the Cecil and made a decision. The hotel's reputation had become a problem. Decades of death, crime, and decay had attached the Cecil name to horror. Online forums traded stories. Ghost hunters asked to stay overnight. The building was famous, but for all the wrong reasons. So management tried to split the difference. They renamed half the building Stay on Main. The concept was straightforward. The lower floors would become a budget hostel aimed at backpackers and young travelers looking for cheap, central accommodation. Dorm-style rooms with bunk beds, shared bathrooms, a communal lounge. Rates as low as $20 per night. The aesthetic would be deliberately casual, even quirky, stripped of the Cecil's grim history and repackaged as affordable adventure in downtown Los Angeles. The upper floors would remain the Cecil Hotel, still operating as a residential hotel for long-term, low-income tenants. Same building, same address, same infrastructure, but with two different brands, two different lobbies, and the hope that guests choosing Stay on Main would never quite realize they were sleeping inside the same structure that had housed serial killers and collected suicides like other hotels collect towels. It almost worked. Stay on Main opened and attracted exactly the clientele it targeted: European backpackers, Australian gap year travelers, budget-conscious tourists who wanted to be near downtown museums and bars. The reviews were mixed, but generally positive. The rooms were clean enough. The staff was friendly. The price was right. If you ignored the neighborhood outside and did not ask too many questions about the building's history, it seemed like a decent deal. But architecture does not forget. The Cecil's infrastructure was still the same aging, failing system it had been for decades. Plumbing problems persisted. Elevators broke down. The air smelled faintly of mold and old cigarette smoke, no matter how much air freshener was sprayed. And the division between Stay on Main guests and Cecil residents was never as clean as management wanted. They shared hallways. They rode the same elevators. The backpackers just did not always know it. The roof access, critically, remained poorly secured. Doors that should have been locked were sometimes propped open. Alarms that should have triggered when someone accessed restricted areas did not always work. The building's scale made total control impossible. 14 floors and 700 rooms cannot be managed like a boutique hotel, with 50 rooms and a concierge who knows every guest by name. The Cecil was too big, too old, and too broken to be truly safe, and putting a fresh coat of paint on half of it did not change that. The rebrand also could not erase the internet. By the 2000s, the Cecil's history was well documented online. True crime blogs, paranormal websites, Reddit threads. A curious guest could Google the address and find decades of horror within minutes. Some travelers booked Stay on Main specifically because of that history, hoping for a brush with the macabre. Others had no idea until they checked in and started reading. Either way, the past bled through. A management's attempt to create two separate realities within one building was always doomed. You cannot split a structure's soul by changing a sign. The Cecil's purpose had been forged over decades. It was a warehouse for the desperate and the dangerous, dressed up just enough to keep revenue flowing. Stay on Main was a marketing experiment layered on top of that foundation, and foundations always win. By 2013, the rebrand had been in place for several years. The hostel side was functioning. The residential side continued as it always had. The building stood at the corner of Main and 7th, 14 stories of contradiction, half trying to move forward and half locked in place by the weight of its own history. And then a young woman from Canada checked into Stay on Main, rode the elevator to an upper floor, and disappeared. Elisa Lam and the Locked Roof. The last time anyone sees her, an elevator camera captures confusion that the internet mistakes for a clue. Elisa Lam arrived in Los Angeles on January 26, 2013, traveling alone as part of a West Coast tour. She was 21 years old, a student from Vancouver, and she checked in to Stay on Main because it was cheap and centrally located. She planned to stay a few days, see the sights, then continue south to San Diego. Her parents expected regular contact. Friends followed her travel blog online. She seemed excited, posting photos and updates from the road. But something was wrong. Elisa had been diagnosed with bipolar disorder and depression. She took medication to manage her symptoms, a combination of drugs that required careful adherence to work properly. Is traveling alone in an unfamiliar city, staying in a chaotic hotel, she may have struggled to maintain that routine. Or the stress of travel may have triggered an episode despite the medication. The exact timeline of her mental state is unknowable, but the evidence suggests she was in crisis. On January 31, 2013, she was supposed to check out of Stay on Main. She did not. Staff extended her reservation. Her family tried to contact her and received no response. On February 1st, they reported her missing to the Los Angeles Police Department. An investigation began, but in a city the size of Los Angeles, missing persons cases often go nowhere fast. Elisa had no known enemies, no signs of foul play, no clear reason to vanish. She simply stopped responding. The hotel became the focus. Police interviewed staff. They reviewed security footage, and on one camera, positioned inside an elevator, they found something strange. The footage, time-stamped from the day before Elisa went missing, shows her stepping into an elevator and pressing multiple buttons. The elevator does not move. She steps back, waits, then leans out into the hallway as if checking to see if someone is there. She steps back in, presses more buttons, then moves to the corner of the elevator, hiding from view. She steps out again, makes odd hand gestures, then steps back in. The elevator still does not move. After more than 2 minutes, she finally leaves, and the elevator doors close. The video is unsettling. Her movements seem erratic, fearful, confused. Online commenters would later speculate endlessly about what it meant. Was she being followed? Was she playing a game? Was she experiencing a psychotic break? The footage became viral, viewed millions of times, dissected frame by amateur detectives convinced they could solve the mystery. Police released the video publicly on February 14th, hoping someone might recognize her or provide a tip. Instead, the internet turned it into a ghost story. The elevator's failure to close or move seemed supernatural. Elisa's gestures looked like she was interacting with something invisible. Theories multiplied. Demons, ghosts, a Japanese horror film with a similar elevator scene, a tuberculosis test with the same name as the hotel. The Cecil's reputation fed the frenzy. Of course, something paranormal was happening. This was the Hotel of Death. But the simpler explanation is bipolar disorder. Elisa was likely in the middle of a manic or psychotic episode, experiencing paranoia, delusions, or severe disorientation. Her behavior in the elevator matches what mental health professionals recognize as symptoms of untreated or poorly managed bipolar disorder. She may have believed someone was following her. She may have been trying to hide. The elevator may not have moved because she pressed the hold button or because it was malfunctioning, which was common in the Cecil. None of it required supernatural intervention. The search continued. Days turned into weeks. Police canvassed the area. They searched her room. They interviewed other guests. But Elisa had vanished completely, and in a city of millions, one missing person is easy to lose. Until the guests at Stay on Main started complaining about the water that carried the truth. Guests complained about low pressure and strange taste, in not realizing the building had turned a death into plumbing. The complaints started subtle. Water tasted odd. Pressure seemed weak. Some guests mentioned the water looked darker than usual, a faint discoloration that could have been rust or sediment from old pipes. In a building as old as the Cecil, minor plumbing issues were routine. Nobody panicked. Maintenance made a note to investigate. By mid-February 2013, the complaints intensified. The taste grew worse. The pressure dropped further. Guests asked for bottled water. Staff assured them it would be fixed soon. But the building's plumbing is complex. 700 rooms across 14 floors, all fed by a system installed in 1924 and patched over the decades with repairs that never quite solved the underlying problems. Finding the source of a water quality issue in a structure that size could take time. On February 19th, a maintenance worker climbed to the roof to inspect the water tanks. The Cecil's water supply is stored in 4 large cylindrical tanks mounted on the roof, each with a capacity of around 1,000 gallons. They sit in a row, exposed to the sun, painted a dull industrial gray. Access requires a key to unlock the roof door, then a ladder to reach the tank platform. Each tank has a hatch on top, secured but not locked. Building codes required the tanks to be accessible for inspection and cleaning, which meant the lids could be lifted by hand. The worker opened the first tank and found nothing. Opened the second, same result. Opened the third, and the smell hit him before he looked inside. Decomposition. Unmistakable. He leaned over the edge and saw a shape floating in the water, darkened and bloated, identifiable only as human. Elisa Lam had been in the tank for more than 2 weeks. Every faucet in the building had been pulling water from the same supply that held her body. Guests had showered in it, brushed their teeth with it, made coffee with it. The building had turned her death into a building-wide contamination, and nobody had noticed until the taste became unbearable. The police were called. The fire department arrived. The decision was made to drain the tank, but that process alone took hours. 1,000 gallons is a lot of water, especially when you need to drain it carefully to preserve evidence. Crews worked through the day, pumping the tank empty while investigators photographed the scene and interviewed hotel staff. When the tank was finally drained, Elisa's body was removed. She was found naked, her clothes floating separately in the water. The medical examiner would later determine that the conditions inside the tank, the warm water and decomposition, made an exact time of death difficult to pinpoint, but evidence suggested she had been there since early February, right around the time she went missing. The immediate question was how. The roof access was supposed to be locked. The tanks themselves were supposed to be covered. Elisa had no obvious way to reach the roof without triggering an alarm or being seen by staff. And yet, she had somehow made it up there, climbed onto the platform, opened a hatch, and entered the tank. Whether she jumped in or fell in or climbed in during a mental health episode, nobody could say for certain. The hotel's security failures became glaringly obvious. The roof door lock was faulty and had been for some time. Staff admitted that access was not consistently restricted. The alarm system that should have alerted management when someone opened the roof door did not work reliably. The tanks had lids but no locks, meaning anyone who reached the roof could open them. And the Cecil had no security cameras covering the roof, so there was no footage of how Elisa got there or what happened once she did. 4 water tanks, 14 floors, 700 rooms. The scale that had once defined the Cecil's ambition now measured its negligence. A building that large requires rigorous systems to keep it safe, and the Cecil had none. The hotel had spent decades prioritizing occupancy over infrastructure, and now the cost was visible in the most horrifying way possible. The news spread globally within hours. The viral elevator footage, the missing person case, the mysterious death, the water tank, all of it combined into a story that seemed designed for maximum horror. The internet exploded, theories multiplied, paranormal investigators descended on the hotel. The Cecil's reputation, already dark, became something closer to legend. But the truth floating in the water was simpler than any ghost story. A young woman in mental distress, staying in a poorly secured building, had accessed a roof she should never have been able to reach and died in a tank that should have been locked. The horror was not supernatural. It was systemic. Accident, outrage, and a city on trial. When the coroner rules it an accident, the story does not end. It mutates into accusation. The Los Angeles County Coroner's Office completed its investigation in June 2013, 4 months after Elisa Lam's body was found. The official cause of death was accidental drowning. The report noted that she had a history of bipolar disorder, that her toxicology screen showed therapeutic levels of her prescribed medications but suggested inconsistent use, and that there was no evidence of physical trauma, sexual assault, or foul play. The conclusion: Elisa had likely experienced a mental health crisis, accessed the roof through an unsecured door, climbed into the water tank, and drowned. The public did not accept it. Online communities erupted. How could a young woman, alone, in crisis, climb into a water tank by accident? The tank was heavy. The ladder was steep. The hatch required lifting. Surely someone helped her. Surely someone pushed her. Surely the hotel was covering something up. The conspiracy theories that had swirled since the elevator video intensified. Some claimed murder. Others claimed supernatural intervention. Nearly everyone rejected the idea that it could simply be an accident. Part of the outrage was understandable. The Cecil had failed Elisa in every possible way. The hotel's roof should have been locked and alarmed. The tanks should have been secured. Staff should have noticed when a guest went missing for days without checking out. The building's entire security apparatus was so broken that a vulnerable young woman could vanish inside it, and nobody realized until her body contaminated the water supply. That is not paranormal, that is criminal negligence. The Lam family filed a wrongful death lawsuit against the hotel. The suit argued that the Cecil had a duty to maintain safe premises and that its failure to secure the roof directly contributed to Elisa's death. The legal process dragged on for years. Eventually, the case was settled out of court for an undisclosed amount. The hotel admitted no wrongdoing. The details remained sealed. But the settlement implied what everyone already believed. The Cecil was responsible, not because it killed Elisa, but because it allowed her to die through sheer indifference. The city of Los Angeles also faced questions. Why had a building with such a long history of death been allowed to operate without more oversight? Why were safety inspections not more rigorous? Why did it take a body in a water tank for anyone to care about the Cecil's condition? the answers pointed to a larger systemic problem. Los Angeles had concentrated its poorest and most vulnerable populations into a small area downtown, then largely ignored what happened there. The Cecil served a function for the city, warehousing people who might otherwise be on the street, and as long as that function continued quietly, nobody intervened. The outrage also revealed a cultural discomfort with mental illness. Many people found it easier to believe in conspiracy or the supernatural than to accept that untreated bipolar disorder could lead someone to make decisions that resulted in their own death. Elisa's story was tragic, but it was also preventable, not through exorcism or ghost hunting, but through better mental health care, better hotel security, and a society that does not abandon its most vulnerable people in places like the Cecil. The media coverage was relentless. Documentaries were planned. True crime podcasts dissected every detail. The elevator footage was analyzed endlessly. And through it all, the hotel stood, still operational, still housing guests, still collecting revenue. The tragedy had made the Cecil more famous than ever, which meant more people wanted to stay there, drawn by morbid curiosity. The building that had survived through tragedy now thrived because of it. The climax was not a chase or a revelation. It was the slow, grinding realization that the horror at the Cecil was not contained. It was systemic. The hotel was not an aberration. It was a symptom of urban neglect, of housing policy failure, of a society that builds beautiful facades and lets the infrastructure behind them rot. Elisa Lam's death forced the city to look at what it had allowed to fester at the corner of Main and 7th. But looking is not the same as fixing. And the Cecil, as it had always done, found a way to survive, a landmark nobody wanted to inherit. The Cecil becomes historic on paper while remaining unlivable in the ways that matter most to the people inside. In 2017, the Cecil Hotel was designated a historic cultural monument by the city of Los Angeles. The designation recognized the building's architectural significance as an example of Beaux Arts design from the 1920s. It also meant that any future redevelopment would have to preserve the exterior facade and certain interior features. The building was now protected by law, frozen in time, made untouchable by preservation ordinances. The irony was thick. The city was protecting a building that had spent decades harming people. The same structure that collected suicides, housed serial killers, and let a woman die in a water tank was now deemed worthy of historical protection. The designation did nothing to improve safety. It did nothing to help the residents living inside. It simply made sure the outside still looked like 1924. Ownership of the Cecil had changed hands multiple times over the decades, each new buyer hoping to turn the building into something profitable. But the math never worked. 14 floors and 700 rooms require enormous capital to renovate properly. The location was improving as downtown Los Angeles gentrified, which meant land values were rising, but the building itself was a liability. Too old, too damaged, too infamous. Developers looked at the numbers and walked away. The landmark designation made redevelopment even harder. You could not simply tear the building down and start fresh. You had to work within the existing structure, preserving elements that were expensive to maintain and difficult to integrate into modern safety codes. The protection that saved the facade also trapped anyone who tried to change the building's function, and the residents kept living there. By the late 2010s, the Cecil was operating primarily as low-income housing, still filling rooms with people who had few other options. The conditions had not improved much since Elisa Lam's death. The infrastructure was still failing. The security was still minimal. But the rent was cheap, and in Los Angeles, cheap rent is survival. Who benefits when a dangerous place becomes a famous place? The answer is usually not the people inside. The Cecil's infamy brought tourists and ghost hunters, people who paid for a night in a murder hotel and left the next morning. But the long-term residents, the people who actually lived there, gained nothing from the building's dark reputation except the knowledge that the world saw them as part of the horror, as extras in a true crime story, rather than as human beings trying to survive. The landmark status also meant the building's future was uncertain. It could not be demolished. It could not be cheaply renovated. It could not be left to decay without legal consequences for the owners. So it sat, preserved but not protected, historic but not safe, a monument to civic failure, dressed up as cultural heritage. Some argued that preserving the Cecil was important precisely because of its dark history. The building was a reminder of what happens when cities ignore poverty and let infrastructure collapse. Keeping it standing kept the lesson visible, but lessons only matter if anyone learns from them, and the evidence suggests Los Angeles had not. Skid Row was still there. Homelessness was still rising. The conditions that created the Cecil's nightmare were still in place. The building had become a landmark nobody wanted to inherit, too expensive to fix, too protected to demolish, too infamous to ignore. It stood at the corner of Main and 7th, 14 stories of contradiction, a monument to the gap between what a city says it values and what it actually does. And then, in the early 2020s, a new plan emerged. Not demolition, not luxury redevelopment, something stranger and perhaps more fitting. Sanctuary built on water and madness. In the end, the Cecil does not disappear. It converts, absorbing the city's homelessness the way it once absorbed tourists. By 2021, the Cecil Hotel had closed its doors to the public. No more transient guests. No more backpackers at Stay on Main. No more ghost hunters paying for a night in the room where someone died. The building's long, chaotic run as a hotel was over, but the structure itself was not finished. Instead, it was being converted into something that made a kind of brutal sense. Permanent supportive housing for the homeless. The Skid Row Housing Trust, a nonprofit that manages housing for formerly homeless individuals, took over operations. The plan was to renovate the Cecil into 600 single-occupancy units with wraparound services, mental health support, case management, medical care. The building that had warehoused the desperate without helping them would now attempt to actually provide support along with shelter. It was redemption, or containment, or both. The conversion made economic sense. Downtown Los Angeles had a massive homelessness crisis. Tens of thousands of people living on the streets, many within walking distance of the Cecil. Building new housing from scratch is expensive and slow. Repurposing an existing structure, even one as damaged as the Cecil, was faster and cheaper. The building's scale, once a liability, became an asset. 600 units could house 600 people, pulling them off the streets and into stability, at least theoretically. But the ethical questions were complex. Was this justice or irony? The Cecil had spent a century extracting rent from vulnerable people while providing almost nothing in return. Now it would house vulnerable people again, but with services attached. The building's soul was hunger. It needed occupancy to justify its existence. And now, instead of tourists or transients, it would be filled with people the city had failed in every other way. The building's purpose had not changed. Only the branding had. The renovation took time. 14 floors, 700 rooms being converted into smaller, more livable units. Plumbing and electrical systems being entirely replaced. The water tanks on the roof, the same tanks where Elisa Lam died, were finally secured and updated. Yet the building was being gutted and rebuilt from the inside, while the exterior remained frozen by landmark protection. The facade would still look like 1924. The function would be 21st century social housing. Resident capacity, once the conversion is complete, 600 individuals. Years of operation as a hotel before closure, 97 years. The economic math of redevelopment, estimated costs in the tens of millions of dollars, funded through a combination of city money, state grants, and nonprofit partnerships. The building had always been expensive to maintain. Now, it was expensive to save. Critics argued that putting formerly homeless individuals into the Cecil was cruel, given its history. Supporters countered that the building was just a building, that the past did not matter as long as the present offered stability. Both sides had a point. The Cecil's history was undeniable, but so was the need for housing. Los Angeles could not afford to let usable space sit empty while people slept on sidewalks. The conversion also raised a larger question about gentrification and displacement. Downtown Los Angeles was changing. Luxury apartments were being built nearby. Restaurants and bars aimed at wealthier residents were opening. Property values were rising. And in the middle of it all, the Cecil was being turned into housing for the very people that gentrification usually pushes out. It was a small resistance, a way of saying this building will serve the poor even as everything around it prices them out. But it was also containment. The Cecil had always been a place where the city stored the people it did not want to see. Now it would serve that function officially, sanctioned by nonprofits and social workers instead of slumlords. The building's hunger remained. It still needed bodies. The difference was that now those bodies came with case files and treatment plans. The Cecil had become a sanctuary built on water and madness, a place where the city's failures were concentrated and, hopefully, addressed. Whether it worked would depend on funding, management, and a commitment to actually supporting the residents instead of just warehousing them. The building could either be redemption or repetition. Time would tell. The price of letting buildings rot. The Cecil teaches a brutal lesson. Architecture can hold beauty, but it can also store the consequences of civic choices. The Cecil Hotel stands today, silent and under renovation, its facade preserved and its future uncertain. 14 floors, 700 rooms becoming 600 units. A building that once promised glamour now promises stability to people who have known neither. The transformation is not complete, but the trajectory is clear. The hotel will not return. What replaces it will carry the weight of everything that came before. The legacy of the Cecil is not paranormal, it is structural. The building became what the city allowed it to become, step by step, decision by decision, lowered standard by lowered standard. It started as a palace meant to sell luxury and safety. It ended as a warehouse for poverty and crisis. That transformation did not happen because of ghosts. It happened because of economics, policy, and indifference. The horror at the Cecil was always about what happens when profit meets neglect and a city looks away, when a building is too large to fail, but not important enough to maintain. When occupancy becomes the only goal and safety becomes optional. When people in crisis are packed into tight spaces with thin walls and minimal oversight, and nobody intervenes until a body floats in the drinking water. Elisa Lam's death forced visibility. It made the Cecil impossible to ignore. But the conditions that killed her had been in place for decades. She was not the first person to die at the hotel. She was just the first whose death went viral. The elevator footage, the water tank, the global media coverage, all of it turned a tragedy into a spectacle. And spectacles, unlike quiet suffering, demand response. The question is whether the response addresses the cause or just the symptom. Converting the Cecil into supportive housing is progress, but it does not explain why the city allowed the building to operate as a death trap for nearly a century. It does not address the policies that concentrate homelessness into small areas. It does not fix the mental health system that fails people like Elisa before they ever check into a hotel. The Cecil is being saved, but the system that created it remains largely intact. Buildings are not neutral, they carry intention. The Cecil was built to extract value from occupancy, and it succeeded at that for 97 years, regardless of the human cost. The architecture itself, the long hallways and minimal oversight and 700 rooms, enabled the tragedy by design. Too big to monitor, too cheap to turn away the desperate, too profitable to shut down. The Cecil also teaches us that cities make choices about what they preserve and what they let rot. Downtown Los Angeles is being rebuilt, block by block, luxury rising beside poverty, new money pushing against old neglect. The Cecil is protected as a landmark, its facade frozen in time, while the people inside were disposable until a non-profit stepped in. That tension between what we preserve and who we protect defines urban development everywhere. Was the horror supernatural? No, it was predictable. When you build a machine designed to extract rent from the vulnerable, when you pack hundreds of people into a failing structure with no support, when you ignore tragedy after tragedy because it is easier than fixing the system, eventually something breaks in a way that cannot be hidden. The water tank was just the moment the machine's failure became impossible to ignore. The Cecil survived because it served a function. It absorbed the people and problems the city wanted to contain. It stayed open because closing it would have required addressing where all those residents would go, what systems had failed them, why so many people needed shelter that cheap in the first place. Easier to let the building stand, easier to look away. But Elisa Lam's death broke that pattern. The story was too viral, the imagery too disturbing, the questions too loud. For once, looking away was not an option, and in that forced visibility, the building's future finally shifted. Not quickly, not cleanly, but shifted. The Cecil is not haunted, it is historical. It holds the consequences of a century of choices, civic and economic, about who matters and who does not, about what gets protected and what gets left to decay. The building stands as a monument to those choices, its facade preserved, and its purpose finally, tentatively, redirected toward care instead of extraction. Whether that redemption holds depends on what comes next, on funding, on management, on whether the city has learned anything from the bodies that piled up inside those 14 floors. The Cecil's legacy is not a ghost story. It is a warning about what happens when we build beautiful things and let the people inside them suffer, about the price of letting buildings rot while the city grows around them, about the moment when neglect becomes complicity and a hotel becomes a machine for loss. The water tank has been drained. The roof is secured. The building waits silent for whatever comes next.